Hi, I'm Aaron White, the North America Economics Editor at openDemocracy. I recently had the pleasure of speaking with Raj Patel and Rupa Marya about their recent book entitled Inflamed: Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice. The book takes the reader on a medical tour of the human body and reveals the relationship between our biology and the injustices of our political and economic system, such as racism, poverty, and colonialism. Patel and Marya ultimately offer a cure of deep medicine to heal our bodies and the world by reconnecting to the earth and each other. Rupa Marya is a physician, activist, artist, and writer who is an associate professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She is also the founder and executive director of the Deep Medicine Circle, a worker-directed nonprofit committed to healing the wounds of colonialism through food, medicine, story, learning, and restoration. Raj Patel is an award-winning author, filmmaker, and academic. He is a research professor in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. Our conversation offers insight into thinking about how to build a reparative economy based on repair, healing, and justice. We discuss the colonial history of modern medicine, how to mourn the tremendous losses of COVID-19, and the demands for reparations from communities around the world. If you like this interview, please consider subscribing to the Our Economy newsletter, which you can access in the description. So I started off by asking Rupa about the process of writing this book.
We literally got on the phone every day at 5 o'clock in the morning, Pacific Standard Time, for a year. Would you say, Raj? About a year?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
And talked. And it's interesting because as I've been complaining about Zoom meetings, and now that we're in the midst of this Omicron surge, and although they told us it would be easy up, easy down, we're seeing California actually starting to plateau at really high numbers, and we don't really understand why. So as I've been complaining, oh, we can't do anything in person and we're so much more effective in person. In fact, Raj and I were highly effective over the phone through these daily discussions and debates and dialogues and, editing and writing and cutting and turning and rephrasing and rethinking. And so it was a very beautiful process, and one that was really held with a lot of care as we confronted our own dynamics around patriarchy and, settler perspectives and, do we have a right to write these things? And just the critical way in which we approached this work together was really beautiful. And it was also founded on the pillow of really loving each other as friends for several years before we embarked on this journey, and loving each other now, even though we've heard each other say the same damn things so many times, right? So it's been a beautiful, really one of the most wonderful things I've done, to be able to crystallize some of these ideas that have been formless in my mind for about 20 years as a doctor, these inklings, these intuitions, these hunches, and to work with such a mastermind as Raj to bring together the social, the political, the economic, the historic, and the epidemiologic with the cellular and the microscopic. And so that was really and just a wonderful experience. And then getting to connect with all of these people within our own circles of the work that we've done through the years, and walking in solidarity with different groups who are doing wonderful work in care and repair already. They're advancing new systems, so that we get to connect with those people and bring them into this work was really lovely.
And I mean, if there's anything to add, I mean, it's just that, Aaron, it may seem as if we're coming at things from a different perspective. And obviously Rupa's experience on the front lines at things like Standing Rock and being a medical doctor are absolutely sort of vital to us being able to make this book happen together. But also, the idea that food and medicine are different worlds is something that we kind of understood there was something wrong with that. This division that exists under capitalism, that food is over here, and the food system and all that involves is on one side, and then the medical system's on the other, and never the twain shall meet, and so we have to reknit them together. That idea is itself the product of colonial thinking. Ours is the only civilization in which food and medicine are really quite distinct domains, and for quite a lot of folk and quite a lot of people in human history. Food and medicine have been really not as hard to think about separately as we do these days.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can kind of just, the book tackles a lot of different crises. I'm wondering if you can kind of just diagnose this sickness, this inflammation that you guys discuss, and how your book is counter to this liberal self-help individual kind of guidance also.
Guidance like, oh, you just need to get a vaccine and then toss away your mask and we're all fine. That over reliance on individual solutions, or just buy an electric car and everything, climate change will just magically disappear. What we do is go down to the roots of understanding how we got to the place where we have wildfires in California now in January, after the highest amount of rain that we've had in decades. We still get these wildfires. We got here because of a system of thought that severed humanity from the living world around us, from the web of life that supports our wellness. And that severance happened in service of advancing an economic, social program that has infected the entire globe. And that is truly the pandemic that we've been living with for 600 years. And coronavirus is the latest iteration of catastrophe, as is climate change. But there are several catastrophes that have been smoldering and burning for centuries. And so what we look at is the root cause of those catastrophes. So instead of just advocating for more DEI training or more, Black presidents, we look at what is actually causing the root of the disease, which is what we identify as the colonial capitalist cosmology, and everything that how it insinuates itself into every aspect of our lives.
And I love also, Aaron, that you use the word diagnosis there, because that's something obviously that is really central to our project. Because when we talk about diagnosis, we're precisely not following the path of storytelling in which the patient is both the locus and usually the cause of disease. And so if Rupa has a fantastic example of the diabetic patient who comes in and blames themselves for diabetes, when in fact it's really hard if you are living on SNAP support, and if you are trying to make ends meet and there's not enough money to be able to pay rent, pay for insulin, and a good meal, that to control your diabetes is incredibly difficult on a low income. And somehow that's your fault, not a structure and not a system in which the insulin manufacturers are making off like bandits. So the story of diagnosis is in fact a sort of narrative art in which certain subjects are sort of preformed even before the patient-doctor encounter, right? The idea of the hysterical woman or the uncontrollable Black man, right? The idea that there are these individuals who present themselves as part of a social narrative already, so that the doctor's job is to sort of rubber stamp the way that social authority works. That's the way that certain modes of diagnosis have tended to operate in the past. And that's precisely what it is that we're trying to undo. And so I'm very grateful, Aaron, that you're bringing up this idea of diagnosis, because what we're trying to do is different kinds of storytelling, recognizing that actually the patient is this, if the patient is this preformed subject, and that subject is one that's always been an individual, then already we're limited in what it is that we can imagine ourselves doing to promote change, right? That's why, as Rupa's saying, there's no point. The capitalism offers us a few pretty basic and obviously stupid ways of tackling climate change. Driving Teslas, carrying tote bags, and drinking through a metal straw. Right. How is that going to solve the ecological crisis? It's not entirely clear, but nonetheless, these are the things that you as an individual can do. So you probably do them. And yet to ask beyond that, what it is that one might be doing in community, in a circle, to imagine that in fact the individual is not the locus of responsibility, but is the locus of change. That's a very different kind of storytelling when it comes to medicine, to food, and to politics.
Right. I'm wondering if you can expand on, you devote a decent amount to this history of modern medicine and its connections to colonialism. and the way that this traditionally works in our societies right now. I'm wondering if you can kind of dissect that a little bit more.
Well, when we understand that, the colonial project was really enacted through the missionaries, the medics, and the militaries, that medicine was playing a role in asserting the dominance of colonial forces in other people's territories. So it was not interested in keeping all the native people healthy and optimizing their wellness. It was interested in keeping the colonizers healthy, so that they could continue to extract the wealth and dominate those people and their lands. And when you understand that, when you really understand that, then you're not that surprised when you see that Black women have a 12 times mortality rate than white women in the postpartum period in New York City. That you understand that, okay, these are remnants of thoughts and understandings that have really shaped the structures of modern medicine today. That are part of the violences are within, they're embedded into the frameworks and the institutions and the way that the culture recreates itself. When we think about words like the non-compliant patient, right? Doctors interrupt their patients within 11 seconds on average. There's a study that showed within 11 seconds of encountering them. We don't tend to think of, what is our patient the expert in their body through their lived experience in their own body with their disease? Most of the time, doctors who really focus on narrative medicine and history taking, you can find out what's wrong with somebody within 95% of the time by just really, really, really listening, and asking the right questions and listening to how a person reveals the story of their illness. And then asking some more questions about what's going on around the body, what are the exposures, the sum of the exposures from that person, what are their histories, their ancestries, what kind of traumas are they carrying through generations, how is that then impacting the cellular function of the immune system. So all these things are much more intricately tied, the individual to the web of life around them. And what it was so fascinating about this book for me as a practicing doctor was that, we were used to think of the immune system as something that fights off invaders, again, like a very colonial, us versus them, this dichotomy, this Cartesian dualism that is really a part of our understanding, whether it's in medicine or how we address ecology right now. These Enlightenment era fallacies that continue to I guess you could call it pervert the way we're able to understand what we're seeing in front of us. So that those ways of seeing were how I learned about the immune system. But as we studied and read for our book, I started to understand that the immune system is actually our harmonizer with the world around us. So if the world around us is toxic and damaging, the immune system responds with damage and trying to remediate that damage, which sets off its own cycles of more damage inside the body, which is registered as chronic sterile inflammation. But if the world around us is in balance, ecologically, socially, politically, then the immune system harmonizes with balance. And so it's not that, so to focus on each individual and say, oh, you just need to juice and take this probiotic pill and, go get some more exercise and sleep better, it misses the whole point, because you can't actually get better health outcomes until you start working on the level of restructuring the world around our bodies. And that is not something any individual can do. That is something we must do collectively, and is happening right now collectively. And those are the stories that we were, that we uplifted in the book.
And just to take that idea, I mean, one of the joys of having worked with Rupa on this book is now when I think about, if I'm feeling a bit under the weather, I won't say I'm fighting something off. I'll remind myself that I'm learning to live with something. And that's important because, even the language of colonialism, Roman colonialism is there, right there in the word immunity. When the Romans were busy in the Mediterranean trying to figure out how to bring other cities into the empire, but also to recognize that there was something special about the Romans. The Romans were supreme above other cities. Then they needed a term to denote the ways that folk in conquered cities were free, but not subject to the same duties as Romans were. And so the idea of munera, duties in Latin, was used to denote the civitates liberae et immunes. So free cities, but immune, not subject to the same duties. And that's that colonialism, the language of straight colonialism from the Roman Empire is there when we talk about immunity. It's not the same as us. But the contours of not the same as us can be understood either in these sort of military metaphors or the idea of a police metaphor, or as the idea of an ecotone, a sort of zone of different life forms coming together and encountering one another with valences that might involve danger, but also might involve mutualism and care.
And that's where, to piggyback off that, the concept of ubuntu was when I learned writing this book from South Africa, this concept that, I am because you are, that my wellness is predicated on your wellness. And so that by caring for you, I'm also caring for myself. And that is something, if we took that approach to the pandemic, we'd probably be in a far different place. But that concept of ubuntu very much is relevant to looking at how the body responds with the gut microbiota inside of us, so that we are healthy because of the way we tend our forests inside of us. If we ignore all the organisms around and in us that are totally necessary for our proper immune, endocrine, and neurologic functioning, then we will be unhealthy because of it. And that's why we see, the least biodiverse guts on planet Earth belong to people who live in urban environments constructed by colonial capitalism. The people with the most biodiverse guts on Earth and also the lowest amount of chronic inflammatory disease are those people living very integrated in reciprocity with the web of life around them. So indigenous communities, hunter-gatherer communities, small horticultural communities. And so that framework is, there's wisdom in those ways that Western science has totally missed. And that's why, with the vaccine, I do recommend that all my patients get vaccinated, because we've seen that with COVID, it decreases hospitalization, severity of illness and death. With Omicron now, it doesn't matter if you're vaccinated or not vaccinated, you're still able to get infected. But it does decrease that severity of illness. But it's not everything. It's not enough. When you're having people who are being forced into exposure, being low-wage workers, being, the immunists of our modern society, the undocumented, the, indigenous, the Black, the brown, the poor. So then you have actually a lot more that needs to be done than just vaccinate people. You have to actually restructure the world around those bodies for them to have different health outcomes. And that's the place where we're hitting the wall, right? Oh, well, that's why they keep talking about vaccine. Like, everyone vaccinate, boost, get 4 doses. But let's not talk about universal basic income and canceling debt and canceling mortgage and mobilizing the working class to really be able to control their work environments for their own safety and wellness. And so that's kind of where we're at with the pandemic.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a bit with the immunist conversation, how that connects to borders today. And I know that in our time of rapidly increasing climate change and global inequality now, where we're having, there's increasing kind of eco-fascism, a lot of people are calling it. So what does, and then you connect this to the border of the body and all these, and kind of our intersection with life around us. I'm wondering what you think your book offers to teach us kind of about borders and why this is central to kind of repair and healing.
Well, I mean, this narrative that we have about our bodies is the same fiction that we have about nations, which is one founded on an illusion of purity, that somehow our bodies are just, there's one thing and it's me, and I'm this, and it's just me, and that Ayn Randian sort of fantasy about your body is why you need to eat organic food, for example. You know, if you look at the sort of outright websites, if you look at was it InfoWars, for example, you'll see vast amounts of conspiracy theory stuff and then GMO-free organic survival food. How are these linked? Well, because your body is a temple just in the same way as the nation is, and you don't want to defile it with the impurities of, you know, sort of Jewish capitalism and you know, the sort of specious ideas of, you know, defilement that come with the chemical industry and Soros money in, you know, making its way through genetically modified crop. I mean, I'm trying to figure out what the sort of anti-Semitic fiction is here, but I'm sure there is one. And you know, the idea is that, again, you see a lot of people buying organic food not because they give a shit about workers in the field who are exposed to these you know, these horrible pesticides where they have much higher risks of a range of outcomes, not just for them but for their children. But instead, you see people buying organic food because, you know, of this idea of precious bodily purity. I mean, you see it in, you know, Dr. Strangelove. You know, your precious bodily fluids is part of the idea of a national myth. Now, the idea of the border is precisely that it is this gatekeeping thing that stops the defiling, you know, pollutant of the immigrant coming in and messing with what you understand to be the sort of pristine national, you know, sort of virginal, and again, this is always a sort of sexualized and gendered phenomenon. This is sort of the virgin lands of your pure nation home. And again, you know, what we point out is this sort of history of miscegenation and muddiness. And in fact, the body is not one thing. It is a holobiont. Human beings are assemblages of lots of different living beings, you know, bacteria, but not just bacteria, archaea and fungi and viruses. We have a range of living beings that without which we couldn't live, that are not us. And that recognition of impurity is an important part of understanding how it is that we should rethink the way, you know, the way we characterize the ways that we as holobionts engage with the rest of the web of life.
And it's a fiction, and that's what was, you know, so important to understand, is that this concept of the body self individual is based on a fiction, and not only a fiction, a real gross misunderstanding of who we are. As assemblages of organisms. And so it really throws into the question our concepts of identity as individuals, as communities, and also as nations, and then why those borders are set up in that way, and to understand that the policing of borders has always been a part of the colonial capitalist project. And, you know, to restrict the flow of people and resources is how the system works, to really have these choke points so that you can create relative scarcities and desperation amongst certain groups of people and other areas of concentrated wealth. And so once we understand that these are fictions, we can ask ourselves, is this the best story to tell in this day and age, in this moment where we're going to have increasing frequencies of catastrophic wildfires and floods and hurricanes and people who are desperate on the move? What is the best way to approach this? What is the most healing way to approach this with the levels of ecological trauma that are coming and are already here?
Another area that I found that we're interested in, and I feel like is interesting in this book, is kind of the connection between debt and stress. And you guys write that some studies have found a dose-response effect between levels of debt and odds of suicide. The greater the debt, the greater the level of mental distress. But then also connecting this to public debt, sovereign debt, and kind of the way that our multilateral institutions kind of work and these power imbalances. That was quite big, but I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to this phenomenon of debt and stress and kind of this control and how it materializes kind of within the body.
I was surprised, and I'll let Raj tell the great. He has a great way of explaining this, but I'll just say quickly that I was surprised to learn that such a large percentage of cardiovascular events happen without any cardiovascular risk factors. that was something that, I was taught, someone comes in, they're having a heart attack. You ask about smoking and family history and tobacco use and cholesterol, and you ask about these typical risk factors. But I think in one study we found it was up to 40% of events happen without any of those risk factors. And one of them was one of my colleagues at work in hospital medicine. One of them was another hospitalist who we described in the book, Heather. And when you listen to these women working under extraordinarily stressful situations, carrying huge amounts of debt through medical school, and then working in a very toxic hospital environment, you're seeing all these people who have no cardiovascular risk factors have these heart attacks in their 40s. And so it is, debt itself is a, independent driver of inflammation through stress, through that access in the body. And Raj, can you tell us about the payday loans?
So payday, well, let's rewind to something you were just mentioning earlier on, Rupa, which is about the living wage, right? But why is it that the economy, why we have so many politicians keening about the need for people to return to work? It's because the economy depends on low wage work and the exploitation of workers in particular. And that has a known medical consequence. I mean, particularly when we understand the desperation of some working class folk who need at some point to be able to take payday loans because they can't make rent and feed the family and pay for medicine at the end of the month. And so you take a bridging loan. And payday loans, like a payday loan of $300 can result in a total repayment of $800, right? An APR of 400%. And those kinds of loans drive inflammation, because again, inflammation is not just your body's response to danger, but it's also the threat of danger. If you are worried about not being able to live in your home at the end of the month, that occasions the kinds of chronic inflammation that will lead to adverse outcomes. And what one study found was that if we were to ban payday loans, we would be able to reduce suicide mortality by 2.1% and fatal drug poisoning by 8.9%. So at an individual level, you can see that the push to return back to normal in the economy is the conscious desire by certain politicians and a certain class of folk to shove the working class into more cycles of inflammation and knowingly to send people out to face greater risks of suicide and of drug overdose. But Aaron, you were asking about, well, how does this relate to national level and international kinds of transfer? We're hearing right now about COVAX and about the great largesse of the global North and giving away to these to these folk in the global South literally dozens of vaccines. And although sadly COVAX at the moment is not able to buy anymore because they've run out of money for syringes. Let's assume COVAX was working and that these sort of banner headlines of largesse were actually true. The fact remains that the global North still has, as a holding over the heads of the global South, vast amounts of debt that dwarf the pitiful amounts of debt relief that are being offered at the moment and are being sort of mooted by the IMF. And then, of course, behind that debt is something that's really at the heart of our conversation today, which is that while it appears on paper that the global South owes the global North in the tune of half a dozen, $6-7 trillion, we have ledgers of the debt that was occasioned through colonial conquest that dwarf that. One study by Utsa Patnaik, for example, with some very conservative understandings of what an appropriate interest rate would be, has demonstrated that if we were to do any kind of serious accounting of what just the United Kingdom has taken from India and its, the compounding of that interest rate over time, the value of what the UK has stolen from India today in 2022 would be above $66 trillion. So that's a sort of more recent calculation than the one we were able to put in the book, but it's reflective of the fact that interest compounds over time, and today 66 trillion is roughly what it is that is the net present value of what the UK stole.
whenever I hear that, when we talk about the debt of the global south to the global north, no one's talking about how much was stolen from our homelands. The reason why I was born here in Ramaytush Ohlone territory in what's now called San Francisco Bay Area is because all of that was stolen from our homelands. And so, yeah, that calculus, when you only extend the ledger so far and you don't go down to like when did we start really interacting with our economies, then you know, how do you repair for the genocide of the indigenous people of the United States? How do you repair for the stolen families, the children who've been ripped from their families, not only through the legacies of slavery in the United States, but now the children in cages that are still in cages under the Biden administration. So these are, you know, deep structures that need to be looked at honestly, and repair that the accounting is overdue.
Yeah, and I'd like to kind of ask what you think that reparative agenda should entail. I know one part of it might be reparations, but also just beyond monetary payments, how we need to approach this.
Well, one of the things we're doing, you know, here in occupied and unceded Ohlone territory is getting land back, and I think that is absolutely a priority in you know, in places where indigenous people have been pushed off their lands, not only here in North America, but also now in India, with Modi's regime of, you know, trying to clear cut forests and push people off of places where they want to mine. So I think that, you know, with you know, understanding in the context of climate change that the people who are stewarding the land the most effectively to combat climate change are people who are living with value systems that come from these indigenous traditions of reciprocity and mutual care and mutual aid. I think that's a major part of the work that I would like to see happen, and then uplifting and, you know, supporting people in their healing from trauma. That, you know, we can't just expect people who've been traumatized by capitalism to want to get on board and become good capitalists. That we actually need to take apart this toxic economic system and build one that is healing and regenerative and focused on care.
And when we think about sort of care and repair, right, you're right that the reparation is a part of it. You know, I mean, there's a very good straight liberal policy of affirmative action that is still a good idea. And of course, that it is a good idea and not a terribly, well, wasn't a terribly controversial policy, is shown up by the vast opposition that's being, you know, that it faces now. I mean, here in Texas, for example, our state commissioner for agriculture is opposing the reparations and the you know, a recognition that Black farmers in Texas in particular have been discriminated against in the history of this state, you know, Texas, the state that fought for slavery twice. So our agriculture commissioner is fighting this affirmative action, where, you know, historically the USDA has, you know, has lost one of the biggest lawsuits in American history because it was racist. And yet when the USDA tries to do the right thing for once, and really with slivers of cash, we have the sort of white uprising here in Texas to defend the rights of the white settlers on this land. So, you know, I mean, I think that you're right to ask this question about reparation, and to observe also that even in its least controversial dimension, right, just simple affirmative action, all of that's being rolled back, and not just in the United States. I mean, you see these bourgeois protests in India, for example, against allocations for what they're called scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. You know, within the caste system, there are communities who have been historically incredibly discriminated against under the sort of yoke of Hindu supremacy. And they find themselves now, after years of actually benefiting to some degree from affirmative action in the government, the objects of derision and scorn, precisely because they achieve some modicum of favor in the allocation of government jobs, and particularly in a moment where those jobs are, where employment is generally precarious. That kind of very minimal reparative work is being undone. So, globally, this is something that is under threat, but it's something that absolutely needs to happen. But it is not enough, as Rupa was saying. I mean, if we are interested in repair, and this isn't just about infrastructure, this is about re-knitting and re-recognizing and learning to see once again the bonds that have been sundered by colonial capitalism. And that's a very big project.
And also the role of, I mean, that's where the role of the work of, the luminaries such as Angela Davis, and understanding the importance of abolition in this work, that we have to, not only, the work is not simply just to get rid of things like the prison industrial complex and policing, and those borders that have been put in place to actually hold the damage within certain populations, to keep that damage really, to shelter the elite and to, pummel the masses. That in addition to dismantling, it is the radical act of imagining what a future looks like where those things are not needed, where that harm is not actually a part of the equation. And that is such important work. And that really is the future horizons of this work. And there's brilliant scholars here in Oakland, where I live, Kat Brooks and the Anti-Police Terror Project, working on the Black New Deal, has been very important to articulating what it is that the community needs in order to not be, sucked into the hell of the gang life and the crime here in the Bay Area. But the white lash, that's what we're calling it. First you had George Floyd, everyone's like Black Lives Matter. Oh, but maybe they don't matter that much. So let's go back over here and, give the police all their money. And, property crime, that's a real big problem. Our property is actually more valuable than Black lives. And so that's that calculus, which is part of a colonial capitalist cosmology. Our property is more important than Black and Indigenous and Brown lives. That's how the Potosi silver mine happened, like where, Indigenous peoples were, debt was created to force them to go into the mine and riddle their sacred mountain with holes to bring the Spanish silver. It's the same mentality. The property, the silver, the economy is more important than the health of these people. And so at what point are we done with that violent narrative? At what point do we insist that our humanity is actually more important than violating the rights of so many people around the world? And without, without real cause, aside from maintaining this power structure and order. And so that work of abolition throughout is critical, and it's imaginative work, it's creative work. It's not simply, burn it all down, but it's like, we could actually do this better, and in a way that is more generative of health for all, because health is not something you can pursue on an individual level. Health is a phenomenon that emerges out of systems working well together at their intersections, and how they phase and work well together, how they harmonize. And right now they're dissonant, and they're dissonant on purpose. They're not dissonant as a mistake, they're dissonant by design. And so what we try to articulate in our book Inflamed is what that harmony can sound like and look like and feel like.
I feel like what's central to that, which I really enjoyed, is this process that you call of public collective mourning. And it strikes me, even in the US, we've dealt with so much loss. More than 2,000 people are dying today. It doesn't seem like there's any outlets or channels for mourning, reckoning, or accountability. And can you guys kind of speak to that, and what the significance of vocalizing this grief? And why that's so central to this project.
We this is such a small scale, but we are through this writing of the book, as we were finishing the book, I ended up creating a collective, calling my good friends, including Raj, to be part of this collective called the Deep Medicine Circle. And we are working to return land back to Ramaytush people. We are farming with them. We are reframing farming as an act of care. We are decommodifying food. We're creating a toolkit so people can do this all over wherever they want. But in the collective, there are, healers, doctors, nurses, herbalists, and the nurses were like, let's bring people to the land because we actually need to collectively grieve. And the amount of PTSD that we are harboring in our bodies right now is, I can't keep dates straight anymore. I'm just like 2-3 years into this. I'm like, oh my God, what I'm seeing in the hospital, nurses walking around glassy eyed and crying, the level of demoralization of our health workers. So we decided to start bringing doctors, nurses, frontline workers, anyone who works in a hospital, basically, to the farm to sit in circle and engage in story, medicine, engage in self-care learning practices, and collectively to grieve. And now this is a small group of people, but the overwhelming response from the healthcare community locally is just, people are so hungry for it, because not only have we seen like stuff that's blown our minds, we've been gaslit in the media, we've been gaslit by some of our own colleagues, and that need to sit together and cry and hear each other's humanity through this experience, to compost our trauma through the land, through reconnecting, to sit with our Indigenous elders and process this, is a critical part of a reparative world. That we actually need to create space for this. We need to create systems of holding this grief and putting it to rest. And in California Native cultures, there were ceremonies. There's something like a cry ceremony. And so we're working with some of our medicine folks to discuss like, what are the proper ways to do this as non-Indigenous people? Because we don't have anything in our society. Colonial capitalism doesn't actually give you real ways to heal from the violences of it. They give you, insulin injections, but not like, what are you holding in your body through this violence that you're experiencing every single day, that you're witnessing when you walk past that person who's sitting on the street, sleeping on the street, a child's on the street, and you look away. That act of looking away, as my friend Tiny Greg Garcia says, is an act of violence. You have violated your duty, your duty to your fellow human by just looking away. And even though you think it doesn't cause a toll, keep adding that up and what happens to our beings. And so that is, the sum of our experiences in this system needs to be collectively composted, needs to be collectively digested. And when we arrive at that place of shared grieving, then the imaginings can happen where we say, actually, we don't want this anymore. We don't want this anymore. And I kind of think about the way Germany, and I'm not, uplifting anyone as perfect or terrible here, but the way German, I tour with my band in Germany a lot. We play music out there, and the openness of people to the kind of music we do and what we do has always really struck me. And we play, music in several different languages. We're like intentionally all over the map. And what strikes me is that the people culturally, Germany has reckoned with the Holocaust. In the United States, Britain has never reckoned with the violence it's done all over the world and how it screwed all these different people all over the world for generations, and the trauma and poverty and misery that continues in its wake, right? So the United States has never reckoned with the violence and the tragedy and the genocide of the Indigenous people. And the genocide here in the United States was used by Hitler as like an example. What a great idea. Look what they did. They like rounded them all up, put them on reservations, killed a bunch of them. That sounds like something we could do over here in Europe. So Germany has gone through process And it's not just saying, I'm sorry. These processes of repair have to go deep. And it's part of our psyches as people and collectives, as individuals. And it has to be material instead of simply just like I'm sorry day. It has to be land back. It has to be power and materials. And so that is, how repair happens is in the reimagining of lines of power, in the redrawing of those lines. So yeah, it's deep and really important work, especially now.
And I mean, in Inflamed, we talk about how it is that work is actively suppressed as part of sort of the colonial narrative. Today, what do you get if someone dies? You get an autopsy. That's the ritual that happens, and then maybe a Zoom funeral, and God knows we've been to too many of those over the past couple of years. But the sort of collective singing and the memory work is always in other cultures and in other histories has always been a really important part of how it is that one commemorates. So the British, for example, were particularly keen to stop wailing and grieving women, in part in India, because in certain parts of India, the grief at the death of someone was usually accompanied by singing that was also a narrative of why it is that they had died at the hands of the British. That there is in the memory of the dead songs that can be sung, and this is not just India that does this. You have corridos in Mexico, for instance. You have many traditions in which remembrance is not just an individual thing of posting something on a website saying how sad you are, but it is a collective process of breathing and of healing and of engaging in these sort of very physical anti-inflammatory practices as the first step in first you grieve, and then as part of these sort of steps of denial, until finally you move to a stage where you are able to do something. And in the history of colonialism, stamping out the collective moments of grief, whether it's about funerals in South Africa under apartheid, which were also prevented, and which were also moments of great organizing and mobilization, or whether it's these moments in colonial Indian history where the British stopped women in particular singing, or whether it's just about the sort of technologies that we've managed to deploy so that we forget the dead. All of that is are ways in which we are colonized in the ways that we think about our lives being as short as they are, but also what it is that we might be doing when we remember their end so that other people's lives can be better. So, if we're thinking about reparations, then yes, grieving is important, and reckoning and narrating history in different ways and doing it together so that we can collectively retell history and then recuperate from that what it is that we want as a trajectory for the future.
Yeah, one of my favorite sections was about jazz. You guys talked about that in Congo Square in New Orleans, and the intersection of all different cultures, and the tradition just of the blues and jazz in America more generally. I think it's fascinating, intersecting all this. Running out of time, just lastly, I'm wondering if you can kind of just, where do you think we stand right now on this process? I guess there was the intense mobilization with Black Lives Matter. Before that, there's kind of more of a younger kind of radical generation, climate activists, Black Lives Matter activists, racial justice, kind of, I guess, trying to push this agenda a little bit more so onto the fore. I'm wondering, where do you see this trajectory, this project kind of playing out?
I see a great awakening happening right now. I see young people, oh my God, so active and mobilizing. There's a lot of introspection happening right now about, what's gone down in the last 2 years. A lot of care and thought about how to move right now, given the constraints and concerns about this very unknown impacts of this virus, unknown long-term impacts of this virus. I'm excited. I can just say that. I'm just talking from the medical perspective right now, because and the community organizing, like what I'm seeing with the youth around gaining access to land, growing food, giving food away, creating community clinics, like creating what Raj said the other day that stuck with me, creating health without doctors. That's deep medicine. That's the medicine of like creating new structures. And there's so many of these things happening all over the world right now. And so I think the more that we network and connect and understand that even though we don't shape the media narrative, there's a whole thing happening in these ecosystems that are starting to overlap and intersect. And so I'm very optimistic and excited.
I'm with you. I do think it's sort of the best of times and the worst of times, isn't it? We've at the same moment we've got this sort of movement of young people who definitely want to be on the land and reconnect, and who find actually growing food and figuring out ways to get it into the hands of people who need it without the interference of the sort of structures of the economy that we've come to normalize. That upsurge is happening at the same time as farmland consolidation is happening. The biggest farm landowner for farming in the United States is Bill Gates. And he's not alone in wanting to park his assets into these into this land that is, as Madeleine Fairbairn says, it's like gold with yield. And so all of a sudden, our land and our the biome of the soil and our relationship to it is also an asset class, and one that's in which the billionaires are quite keen to invest. We've got Germany engaging in reparations for the genocide that they caused in Namibia, and it's a derisory sum for the kinds of massive violence that they undertook. But they're still quite happy to keep the sort of structures of debt peonage, international debt peonage in place. There's no kind of debt forgiveness, let alone moving towards the kinds of repayments of sums that Germany took from Namibia. That's off the table. This is a kind of and I believe I can say this because I'm using the technical term here. This is fuck off money. This is the idea of a sort of conscience being cleared, because that's what reparations are about, and that's not what reparations means. So at the same time as we've got this kind of the sort of denatured ideas of reparation and these blockages to the kinds of movements we want to see, we are seeing the movements. The Red, Black, and Green New Deal, the People's Green New Deal around the world. These are movements that are trying to subvert the state and use certain elements of the state to be able to create something new and better. And what's characteristic about all of them, and I think this is probably something that brings us back to where you are, Aaron, is that they are very democratic. That they are open and democratic, and I think that characterizes the kinds of reparative work that we want to see. That's very different from the kinds of closed door, soi-disant kind of reparations that are that are nothing like what they should be.